He built a billion-dollar empire with his bare hands. Yet when a woman worth 800 million extended hers, he looked straight through her like she was made of air. What Hyunbin didn't know in that gleaming Manhattan atrium was that the hand he just refused to shake was the exact hand holding the key to everything he had spent his entire life building. Welcome, beautiful people. If you love powerful, emotional stories, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop your location in the comments. What country are you watching from? The night Manhattan swallowed Hyunbin whole, he was wearing a white suit that cost more than most people's cars and standing in a room full of people he had already decided didn't matter. That was the thing about Hyunbin that his PR team quietly documented and his board privately feared. He didn't walk into rooms. He processed them, categorized them, filed every face, every handshake, every business card into one of two mental folders within 4 seconds of visual contact. The folder labeled relevant was extraordinarily thin. The folder labeled background noise was essentially infinite. He had been running the system for 8 years without a single malfunction. Tonight would be the night the system catastrophically crashed. The Pinnacle Summit occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Harmon Tower in Midtown Manhattan, a glass-encased monument to corporate ambition where the chandeliers alone cost more than small nations and the canapés were presented on slabs of imported marble because apparently regular plates had become offensive to wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline like a painting commissioned specifically for people who already owned too many paintings. A jazz pianist in the corner was performing Coltrane with the kind of quiet mastery that nobody was actually listening to because everyone in the room was too busy performing their own version of importance. 43 of the most powerful business figures in the Western Hemisphere were stationed around that atrium like expensive furniture someone had forgotten to sit in. Hedge fund managers, tech founders, private equity wolves in Italian wool. Everyone was performing. Everyone was watching. Everyone was calculating. Hyunbin stood near the far window with his arms crossed, those tattooed forearms locked against his chest like a security door, holding a glass of still water because he didn't drink at professional events and he didn't explain himself to people who thought that was unusual. His CFO G1 hovered 3 feet to his right with the quiet desperation of a man permanently stationed just outside the blast radius. His neck tattoos caught the chandelier light every time he turned his head, which delighted photographers and unsettled men twice his age who had expected someone who looked more traditionally like a billionaire and less like someone who had once fought their way into a boardroom rather than simply being born into one. At 30 years old, Hyunbin was the youngest CEO in the room by a margin so significant it had already generated 4 separate hushed conversations among the older attendees. He had heard 2 of them. He had found them irrelevant. He was mid-conversation with a technology analyst about semiconductor supply chains, a conversation he was conducting on autopilot while his eyes swept the room with the quiet, methodical patience of a man who measured everything when the room shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't announced. It was simply the specific kind of atmospheric change that happens when a person enters a space and the space responds without being asked to. Natasha Soerby walked into the Pinnacle Summit the way dawn walks into a dark room. Not forcefully, not urgently, simply inevitably. She was 25 years old and wore a burgundy suit that fit her extraordinary figure the way great architecture fits a skyline, like it had been specifically designed for that purpose and no other. Her long dark hair moved with her rather than behind her. Her skin caught the light and held it. The rings on her fingers were elegant, without being excessive. Her heels announced themselves against the polished floor with a rhythm so composed it sounded almost like punctuation, each step a complete sentence. 3 conversations near the entrance stopped mid-sentence. The photographer, who had been professionally unmoved all evening, raised his camera instinctively. Hyunbin's 4-second system processed her in approximately 2.
Young.
Unfamiliar face. Not on his pre-prepared mental register of attendees worth engaging. The burgundy suit was excellent. He registered that involuntarily because he understood quality, but excellent clothing did not automatically upgrade a person's folder classification. Background noise, his brain concluded.
File accordingly.
He looked back at the analyst and resumed the semiconductor conversation. What his 4-second system had failed to process. Because 4 seconds is, it turns out, a spectacularly insufficient amount of time to assess a human being, was the quiet $800 million sitting behind those calm eyes. The 18-month trajectory that had made Soerby Capital the fastest-growing investment firm in the American South. The fact that in his own company's board minutes, dated 6 weeks prior, the name Soerby Capital appeared 14 times as the preferred deciding investor for HB Electronics' entire North American expansion strategy. His system had also failed to process the way every senior partner in the room greeted her. The way the CEO of Pinnacle Financial crossed the room specifically to shake her hand. The way even the jazz pianist seemed to straighten slightly when she passed. Hyunbin noticed none of it. He was still processing semiconductors when Natasha, having completed a brief and purposeful circuit of the room, approached him with the measured confidence of someone offering a courtesy rather than requesting one. Her hand extended, open, direct, perfectly poised. Her eyes met his with the calm steadiness of a woman who had absolutely nothing to prove and was extending this gesture anyway, because she was professional, because she was gracious, and because despite everything she was about to discover about him tonight, Natasha Soerby had been raised to lead with class. Hyunbin looked at her hand. His brain ran its 4-second check. Filed her. His arms stayed exactly where they were, crossed against his chest, locked, immovable, the tattooed forearms serving as both physical and symbolic barrier. He looked away, turned 3 deliberate steps to his left. Resumed conversation with Gerald, a balding, aggressively beige man who represented a modest regional distribution company and a vacation timeshare in Orlando, as though Natasha Soerby's extended hand had simply been a minor atmospheric event. A passing weather pattern. Something requiring no response. The room went silent the way rooms only go silent when something genuinely unforgivable has just occurred in plain sight. The jazz pianist hit a wrong note for the first time all evening. Priya, Natasha's assistant, appeared at her elbow like a small, furious guardian angel. Her mouth opened. Natasha said quietly before Priya could produce a single word. She withdrew her hand with a composure so absolute, so perfectly calibrated, it was almost more devastating than outrage would have been. She did not flush. She did not falter. She simply turned, graceful, unhurried, entirely self-possessed, and redirected her attention toward the CEO of Harmon Ventures, who practically materialized from across the room to greet her with both hands and an expression of profound professional relief, as though the universe had corrected a brief and troubling imbalance. Natasha smiled at him warmly, laughed at something he said, moved forward. That was her power. She never let them see the fire. She simply let it burn, quiet, deep, and absolutely permanent. Hyunbin, meanwhile, was deep in Gerald's detailed explanation of a revolutionary smart blender concept that Gerald believed was going to disrupt the kitchen appliance industry in ways the market was not yet prepared for. It was, by any objective measure, the most expensive conversation in the history of the Pinnacle Investment Summit. He simply didn't know that yet. If you believe everyone deserves to be seen regardless of who they are, hit subscribe. Only the Hyunbins of the world won't. Where in the map are you watching from? The morning after the Pinnacle Investment Summit arrived in Manhattan the way bad news always does. Uninvited, early, and carrying documentation. Hyunbin was seated at the hotel restaurant on the 38th floor of the Four Seasons, working through his third espresso and a quarterly report that required his full attention, when Jiwon walked in wearing the expression of a man who had recently survived something and wasn't entirely sure he had. Jiwon never sat without being invited. It was an unspoken rule between them, one of approximately 40 unspoken rules that governed their professional relationship, all of them existing purely because Hyunbin had never needed to speak them aloud. People simply learned. Jiwon sat down without being invited. Hyunbin looked up from his report.
That bad, he said.
Jiwon placed his phone on the table face up, screen glowing, and slid it across with a careful, deliberate motion of a man defusing something. Hyunbin looked down at it. The video had 17 million views. Buy breakfast. The caption read, **, young Korean CEO blanks black female investor at NYC Summit. She has more money than his last 3 deals combined, by the way. Asterisk Hyun Bin watched himself turn away from Natasha Soerby's extended hand in crisp, unforgiving, high-definition clarity. The camera had caught everything: the dismissal, the pivot, the 3 steps toward Gerald, and his revolutionary blender ambitions. It had also caught, in the background, the precise moment the room collectively decided Hyun Bin had made a grave error in judgment. 40 powerful faces. 40 identical expressions. None of them flattering. He set the phone down. "How many partner emails?" he asked. 11. "How many are friendly?" Ji-won's silence was its own complete answer. Hyun Bin's own mother had texted 7 times. The 7th message was a single period. Just one. Sitting there like a tiny black hole at the end of everything. In 28 years of knowing his mother, she had never sent a single period text. She had, in fact, never sent a message fewer than 4 paragraphs. That single period represented a depth of maternal disappointment that no words could have achieved more efficiently. It was almost impressive. Ji-won then produced the printed email. He placed it on the table with the solemnity of someone presenting Exhibit A in a trial that was already lost. It was from Soerby Capital's office. Sent at 5:58 in the morning. She had already been at the gym, which was, somehow, the detail that bothered Hyun Bin most, though he couldn't have explained why. Asterisk, Ms. Soerby appreciates your interest, and thanks you for reaching out. Her calendar is currently committed through the next quarter. We will keep your request on file. Asterisk, we will keep your request on file. 5 words that, in professional correspondence, translated with devastating accuracy to, "We have filed your request directly into the trash, where it will age peacefully alongside all the other things that do not deserve her time." Ji-won stood up with the practiced smoothness of a man who understood the precise moment to be somewhere else. He straightened his jacket, retrieved his phone, and walked away from the table without a word, leaving Hyun Bin alone with 3 espressos, an unread quarterly report, and the slowly dawning comprehension that his 4-second categorization system had just cost him something considerably larger than his pride. He called Soerby Capital at noon. The assistant, Priya, her name was Priya, and she answered with a professionalism so cheerful it bordered on warfare, informed him pleasantly that Miss Soerby was unavailable. He called again at 1:30. Unavailable. At 2 p.m., he dispatched a handwritten letter via private courier. He had not handwritten a professional letter since university. His hand, unaccustomed to the humility required, produced something that took 4 drafts and looked slightly worse with each attempt. At 4 p.m., he sent white orchids. An arrangement so architecturally significant it required its own luggage cart through the hotel lobby. 3 guests stopped to photograph it. 1 asked if someone had died. At 5 p.m., Natasha Soerby was on her Peloton, 32 minutes into a 45-minute ride, resistance at level 18, not remotely out of breath, when she finally accepted his 5th call. "Mr. Hyun," she said. Her voice was warm, composed, criminally unbothered. Hyun Bin, who had navigated billion-dollar negotiations without his pulse moving a single digit, found this extraordinarily irritating. "Miss Soerby." He cleared his throat, something he had not done involuntarily in professional conversation since he was 23 years old. "I owe you an apology. A genuine one. What I did last night was dismissive and disrespectful, and I have no adequate defense for it." Silence. Not awkward silence. Comfortable silence. The kind of silence deployed by someone with the upper hand who is in absolutely no rush to release it. "March works," she said finally. "My team will send the details." She ended the call before he could respond. Hyun Bin sat holding his phone for a moment longer than he would ever admit to anyone, staring at the disconnected screen with an expression Ji-won, had he witnessed it, would have found deeply fascinating and wisely never mentioned. It was not irritation anymore. It was something else entirely. Something that sat between professional respect and a feeling he hadn't cataloged before, which was its own particular problem, because Hyun Bin cataloged everything. Except, apparently, her. March in Manhattan arrives like a second chance nobody asked for, but everybody needs. The trees along Fifth Avenue were just beginning to suggest the possibility of leaves. Tentative, cautious, noncommittal, much like every lawyer Hyun Bin had ever hired. The city itself seemed to be deciding whether to commit to warmth or deliver one final cold insult before spring. It was, in other words, a perfectly appropriate backdrop for a meeting between two people who were both pretending this was strictly business. Hyun Bin arrived 12 minutes early to the Soerby Capital offices on the 31st floor of a sleek building in Midtown that communicated wealth the way truly confident people communicate wealth, quietly, without announcement, through sheer quality of everything. The lobby had no reception desk cluttered with paper. No motivational quotes framed on the walls. No aggressive corporate art screaming about synergy. Just clean lines, exceptional light, fresh white orchids, arranged in a tall vase near the elevator bank. He stared at those orchids for a long, humbling moment. They were not his orchids. They were simply Natasha Soerby's standard lobby decor. The universe, apparently, had jokes. Ji-won stood beside him, wearing the expression of a man exercising extraordinary professional restraint. He said nothing about the orchids. He would say nothing about the orchids until he retired, at which point he would tell the story at every dinner party for the rest of his natural life. Hyun Bin had spent an amount of time choosing his suit that he would classify, under oath, as reasonable, and that Ji-won would classify, also under oath, as 45 minutes, including 2 complete outfit changes and 1 extended mirror consultation that Ji-won had pretended not to witness. He had settled on charcoal gray. Understated, precise, no white this time. No armor. He had left the arms deliberately uncrossed in the elevator on the way up, as though practicing. Priya collected them from the lobby with a smile so professionally immaculate it gave absolutely nothing away and led them through a corridor where Natasha's company's achievements lined the walls not as trophies, but as simple documented facts.
Clean.
Confident. I arrived.
Did you?
The boardroom was glass-walled and flooded with morning light. 6 members of Natasha's team were already seated, tablets open, expressions composed. Every single one of them looked at Hyun Bin with the polite neutrality of people who had been thoroughly briefed and had formed very thorough private opinions. Natasha was standing at the window with her back to the door when he entered. She turned exactly when she was ready to turn, which was approximately 4 seconds after he walked in, a delay so precisely calibrated it could not have been accidental, and both of them knew it. She wore a deep navy suit today, tailored immaculately, her dark hair pulled back with the kind of elegant simplicity that takes considerable effort to achieve and zero effort to own. The rings were back. The composure was absolute. She crossed the room toward him, unhurried, direct, and extended her hand. The same steady, open, direct gesture. The entire room held its breath. Hyun Bin was fairly certain his own team held theirs. He was almost certain Ji-won quietly stopped breathing altogether somewhere behind his left shoulder. Hyun Bin took her hand. Firmly.
Properly.
With the full, unguarded directness of a man who had spent 6 weeks understanding exactly what refusing it had cost him. "Mr. Hyun," she said. "Miss Soerby." He held her gaze. "Thank you for the meeting." "You worked hard enough for it," she said pleasantly, releasing his hand and gesturing toward the table. "Shall we?" It was the most exquisitely professional thing anyone had ever said to him. It was also, structurally, a perfect knife, warm handle, cold blade. He almost smiled. Almost. They sat across from each other at the head of the boardroom table, and the meeting began with the precision of 2 people who were extremely good at their jobs and deeply aware of each other in a way that had nothing to do with their jobs and everything to do with the specific electricity that lives in the space between 2 equally matched people who have not yet decided what to do about it. The deal was on the table within 20 minutes. $200 million. HB Electronics North American expansion mapped across 17 slides, each one meticulous, each one bulletproof. Hyun Bin presented with the quiet command of someone who had walked into 1,000 rooms and owned every one of them. Natasha listened the way exceptional investors listen, completely still, completely present, asking questions that arrived like surgical instruments, precise and perfectly aimed. She challenged 3 projections. He defended 2 and conceded 1, which surprised her enough that she paused almost imperceptibly before writing something down. He noticed the pause. She noticed him noticing. Neither acknowledged it. Both filed it. The deal closed in 90 minutes. Signatures, terms, handshakes around the table. Professional.
Clean.
Enormous. Then Natasha's team began filtering out, and the boardroom grew quieter, and in that quieter space something shifted almost without permission. Hyun Bin was gathering documents when he said, without planning to say it, "You pushed back on the projection for Southeast Asian manufacturing costs." "Your numbers were optimistic," she said, not looking up from her own documents. "They were accurate." "They were optimistic," she repeated, and this time she did look up, and there was something in her expression that was no longer purely professional, a brightness, a readiness, the specific energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed a fair fight. "I've run those supply chains. You're underestimating Q3 fluctuations by about 8%. Hyunbin paused. Then, quietly, privately, in a place he would absolutely not be examining tonight, he recognized something that felt dangerously like delight. "I'll have G1 pull the Q3 data," he said. "Please do," she said, and smiled for the first time all meeting. Not the composed professional smile she had worn since the lobby, but something smaller, more genuine, briefly unguarded. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. It was, objectively, 2 seconds too long for strictly business purposes. Hyunbin picked up his documents, straightened his jacket, deployed every year of hard-built composure he possessed. "The orchids in your lobby," he said at the door. She looked at him. "Standard decor?" he asked.
A beat.
Then those eyes registered the reference, and something flickered in them. Not quite a smile, not quite amusement, something considerably more dangerous than both. "Always," she said. He left the boardroom having signed the most significant expansion deal of HB Electronics North American history. He also left having made a decision that appeared nowhere on any of the 17 slides. Ji-won read his face in the elevator on the way down with the resigned accuracy of a man who already knew this story was nowhere near finished, and quietly began rearranging Hyun Bin's New York calendar with the solemn efficiency of someone who understood that the next chapter had already been written. He was right. "Where are you watching from?" 3 weeks after the boardroom meeting, Hyun Bin did something that had no business justification, no strategic precedent, and absolutely no entry in Ji-won's meticulously maintained scheduling system. He called Natasha Soerby directly. Not through Priya. Not through his own assistant. Not via formally worded email with 3 CC'd lawyers and a subject line referencing deal specifics. He called her personal number, which she had included at the bottom of the signed contract addendum, professionally, routinely, the way executives exchange contact information without implication, at 7:43 in the evening on a Tuesday. She picked up on the third ring. Mr. Hyun. Not surprised. Not warm. Perfectly, infuriatingly neutral. "The Q3 manufacturing data," he said. A pause. "It's 7:43. She said. "I'm aware." "In the evening." "Also aware." Another pause, shorter this time, carrying a different texture. Less professional patience. Something closer to reluctant entertainment. "And you were right," he said. 8.3%. Q3 fluctuation. G1 pulled the full report this afternoon. Silence. Then, and he would have missed it if he hadn't been, for reasons he refused to examine, paying extremely close attention, a small exhale. The specific sound of someone who has been correct about something and finds the confirmation more satisfying than they intended to show. "I know," she said. "You knew before I pulled the report. I told you I knew before you pulled the report. I needed the data." "Mr. Hyun," she said, and her voice carried that brightness again, that dangerous, specific readiness. "Did you call me at 7:43 on a Tuesday evening to tell me I was right about something I already knew I was right about?" He said nothing for precisely long enough that the nothing became its own answer. She laughed. Not the composed professional offering from the boardroom. A real one, brief, genuine, caught slightly off guard. It lasted 4 seconds and rearranged something in Hyun Bin's chest that had not been rearranged since approximately never. "Good night, Mr. Hyun," she said and ended the call. He sat in his hotel room. He had extended his New York stay twice now, for reasons Ji-won had documented without commentary, holding the phone and staring at nothing in particular with the expression of a man standing at the edge of a very significant decision, looking down, and finding the drop both alarming and interesting. He called again Thursday. Market analysis, legitimate question, professionally framed. She answered, and they argued about emerging market volatility for 40 minutes with a focused intensity of two people who were not at all talking about emerging market volatility. Friday, he called with a question about portfolio restructuring. She pushed back on his methodology with the precision of a woman who had been doing this since she was 19 years old and found his confidence both impressive and occasionally worth deflating for her own quiet amusement. He found her pushback, against all his better instincts and prior personality, genuinely enjoyable. By the second week of April, Ji-won had stopped pretending the New York schedule extensions were business-related and had simply begun booking the hotel suite on a rolling weekly basis with the quiet resignation of a man who had made peace with the direction of things. The dinner was Hyun-bin's idea, which meant it took him 11 days to execute it. He had navigated hostile takeovers with less strategic deliberation. He had restructured international supply chains with less careful planning. He had launched products into 5 simultaneous markets with less consideration of variables than he gave to the question of which restaurant in Manhattan was appropriate for a meal that was professionally ambiguous, personally deliberate, and required a setting that communicated exactly the right level of intention without communicating so much intention that Natasha Soerby, who saw through everything, always, immediately, would deploy that composed smile and redirect the entire evening. Back to Q3 manufacturing data. He chose a small French restaurant in the West Village. 12 tables. Exceptional wine list. Lighting that was warm without being presumptuous. A jazz trio in the corner. And yes, he had specifically requested jazz because he remembered she had barely glanced at the pianist at the summit, which meant she either loved jazz enough to take it for granted or was indifferent to it, and either way he intended to find out. He told Ji-won it was a relationship maintenance dinner for a key investor. Ji-won wrote that dinner with Natasha in the calendar and said absolutely nothing, which was somehow louder than everything. Natasha arrived 4 minutes after the reservation time, not late, simply unrushed, in a deep green dress that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with intention, and Hyun-bin, who had stood from the table the moment he saw her cross the restaurant, experienced the distinct cognitive disruption of a man whose very efficient brain had completely stopped processing anything useful. She sat down across from him, looked at the menu briefly, set it down. "You requested the jazz trio," she said. Not a question. He met her eyes. "You noticed." "I notice everything, Mr. Hyun." A pause. Then, very carefully, controlled, measured, but real. "It's a nice touch." The candle between them threw warm light across the table. The jazz trio began something slow and unhurried. Outside, Manhattan continued its permanent performance of itself, indifferent to the two people sitting inside a small restaurant having a conversation that was no longer about business and had not been for quite some time. "You can call me Hyun," he said. She considered this with the precise deliberation she applied to every significant decision, thoughtfully, without rushing, with complete awareness of what she was agreeing to. "Natasha," she said. First names. Across a candlelit table. In a city that had watched him humiliate her 4 months ago in front of 40 witnesses and a jazz pianist. The distance between that moment and this one was either the longest journey of his professional life or the shortest, depending entirely on how you measured the space between a closed fist and an open hand. Ji-won, dining alone at the hotel restaurant 3 blocks away with an excellent steak and a very good book, received no calls that evening. He considered this the best possible news. If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or looked through, and then watched someone realize exactly what they threw away, comment, she didn't need him to see her below. And if you can't stand people who judge others before they know them, hit subscribe. People like that won't. 6 months after a man refused to shake her hand, Natasha Soerby stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 7 a.m. on a Saturday in October, wearing a silk robe and an expression she would have described to absolutely nobody, and had a firm, professional, entirely reasonable conversation with her own reflection. "It is a business relationship," she told the mirror. The mirror, unhelpfully, reflected a woman who had changed her outfit 3 times this morning for a business relationship. Priya had noticed the pattern weeks ago. The way Natasha's calls with Hyun ran 40 minutes past their scheduled window, the way she laughed differently during them, not the warm professional offering she deployed for clients, but something looser, quicker, genuinely surprised out of her. Priya had said nothing because Priya was exceptional at her job, and being exceptional at her job meant recognizing which observations belonged in a report and which belonged in the permanent private archive labeled "none of my business," but also absolutely yes. Natasha had built everything she owned on clarity. Clear vision, clear decision-making, clear boundaries between what served her and what simply felt good. Feelings, in her experience, were extraordinarily poor investors. They bought high, panicked early, and almost never read the prospectus. Hyunbin, specifically, was the kind of feeling that came with significant historical liability. This was a man who had looked through her in a room full of witnesses, who had needed a viral video, 17 million strangers, and a $250 million business catastrophe to understand what she represented. That was not, by any objective measure, a strong foundation. She had told herself this 14 times over 6 months. She was running out of convincing delivery. He arrived at her building at 7 p.m. exactly. Not early. Not fashionably late. Exactly on time, which communicated more about Hyunbin's regard for this particular evening than any grand gesture could have managed. He was wearing a charcoal jacket over a black shirt, open collar, no tie, and the neck tattoos were fully visible, unapologetic, entirely himself. No performance. No armor. No arms crossed. She opened the door, and they looked at each other for a moment with a specific charged awareness of two people who had been circling something for months and had both, privately, decided tonight was the last night they were pretending not to. "You're exactly on time," she said. "I was raised to respect people's time," he said, and the reference, quiet, deliberate, landing precisely where he intended, sat between them for one full second before she stepped back and let him in. Her apartment was exactly what he had imagined and nothing like he had expected.
Warm.
Personal. Books arranged by subject rather than aesthetic. A vinyl record player in the corner. Actually used, not decorative. A small framed photograph on the bookshelf of a younger Natasha and two people who were clearly her parents, all three of them laughing at something outside the frame. He looked at the photograph. "Atlanta?" he asked.
"Thanksgiving," she said.
"My mother made sweet potato pie, and my father declared it the greatest achievement in the history of human civilization." A pause. "He says that every year." Hyunbin smiled, not the careful professional version, but the real one, the one Ji-won had seen approximately 11 times in 4 years. "My father used to say my mother's kimchi jjigae could fix anything. Failed exam. Bad day. Business problem."
He stopped.
"He still says it. It still works." Natasha looked at him. Really looked, without the professional filter, without the necessary caution she had carried for 6 months, and saw exactly what she had seen for the first time in the boardroom in March, and had been carefully, sensibly, responsibly refusing to fully acknowledge ever since. One relentlessly self-built person. Stripped of the suit, the empire, the crossed arms, the catastrophic 4-second system that had nearly cost him everything. Just a man from Incheon who had fought his way up from a noodle shop apartment and was standing in her living room talking about his father's kimchi jjigae like it was the most natural thing in the world. Which, she realized with the quiet certainty of a woman who had always trusted her best instincts, it was. They had dinner at the small French restaurant in the West Village, their restaurant now, though neither had said so aloud, and talked for 4 hours about everything that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the texture of 2 lives that had been built from scratch by people who refused to accept the rooms they were handed and had instead built their own. He told her about the noodle shop apartment, the radio parts, his father's hands. She told him about the $3,000 investment, the professor who had doubted her. The morning she woke up to the return figure and sat quietly on her dorm room floor for 10 minutes before she allowed herself to believe it was real. "Why 10 minutes?" he asked. Because I wanted to be sure I was ready to carry it, she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I filed you in 4 seconds. I know. I had a system. I know that too. It was, he said, with the precise, unsparing honesty of a man who had stopped performing 2 hours ago, the single most expensive 4 seconds of my life. Natasha looked at him across the candlelit table in the warm light of a Manhattan October evening and felt the last carefully maintained professional distance between them quietly, finally, close. It was also, she said, the 4 seconds that brought you to my boardroom. And your lobby orchids. And my lobby orchids, she agreed. He reached across the table. Not impulsively. Not dramatically. With the same deliberate, fully considered intention he applied to every significant decision he had ever made, except this time without the 4 second system, without the categorization, without any filter at all. His hand, open, extended across the white tablecloth. The same gesture she had offered him 6 months ago in a glass atrium while 40 people watched and a jazz pianist hit a wrong note. Natasha looked at his hand, then at him. Then she laughed, bright, genuine, completely unstoppable, the laugh that Priya would have recognized immediately as the one that appeared on no professional call ever, and placed her hand in his.
You practiced that, she said. Extensively, he said.
Outside, Manhattan performed its permanent, indifferent, magnificent show. Inside, the jazz trio played something slow and unhurried, and entirely fitting. G1, 3 blocks away, received 0 calls and slept exceptionally well. And Hyun-bin, the boy from the noodle shop apartment, the man who had built a $4.2 billion empire on the strength of his own refusal to be ordinary, sat across from the most remarkable person he had ever categorized incorrectly, holding her hand across a candlelit table, understanding at last that the greatest thing he had ever built had nothing to do with electronics. It had started, as all great things start, with an open hand. And this time, finally, he had taken it. If this story moved you, if you believe that real strength is knowing when to uncross your arms, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're not siding with the version of Hyun-bin who turned away, comment. Open hands build empires below. Trolls and people who still think Gerald's smart blender was a good investment absolutely will not.